child is very involved and she's very focused, and this person and the teacher and the student, is learning and is intelligent enough to be in that class. And also, opponents of tracking they argue that students in lower tracks often have the weaker teachers in schools, because if you see in high school for certain, some of the more veteran, experienced teachers are teaching the upper level classes, whereas the younger, newer teachers are teaching the remedial classes. And because of that, the low achieving students aren't maybe getting the best education they can because they're having new teachers that are still learning along and learning all the processes. So then we're going to get into ability grouping. So this is what occurs in the class. I mean, the teacher decides all that. It's whether, she wants to decide how she wants to split up her class and how she wants to set up her students. Day to day, it can change. There's two types of grouping that could happen. There's this heterogeneous and there's this homogeneous. So to explain these two, let's look at them side by side. So we look at heterogeneous. This includes the low, high. There's a wide range of achieving students per group. So you have some low, some high, some in between. Whereas homogeneous is you're separating the low students and keeping them separate, and the high students with them. And now choosing which one you want to do, it kind of depends on what your goal is with your students. So if your goal is to help the struggling students get along, like if you're doing a review before a test or something, having some low achieving students with high achieving students helps. It's going to have the higher achievers helping and teaching and maybe tutoring some of the lower achievers to get them to the level that they need to be. Whereas if you want them to learn something really higher than their actual initial ability was, sometimes the homogeneous can work, because what's going to happen is if you have the low achieving students together, someone could potentially step up, and that's be new compared to when they were in the heterogeneous, when they would just rely on the higher achieving students to do the job for them. And so this is a video that I might try to share. Let's see if I can get it to work. This is kind of talking from a lady called Jeannie Oakes, I do believe. Mm-hmm. And she's kind of talking about some of the theories behind ability grouping. So let's see if I can get it to go. Go. Let's see. Start it over. Okay.
Well, grouping by achievement is a very complex and imprecise practice that we seem to have a great deal of confidence in as an efficient way to handle individual differences in learning settings. It turns out that there's very little evidence that that theory is effective in the way we practice it in schools. So, for example, the first premise is that children are sufficiently different in the way they learn and what they're able to learn, and that we can diagnose those differences and then divide them into groups that are sufficiently similar so that we can target instruction precisely at the level of those kids. But when you look empirically at the characteristics of children in classrooms, children are extraordinarily diverse in all sorts of ways. And if you group them on one characteristic, you're going to have a huge amount of diversity and variation on other characteristics. So first of all, we fool ourselves into thinking that we've got homogeneous groups of students. So then when we target instruction, rather than thinking about always differentiating instruction to not even accommodate, that's too negative of a word, but to just recognize and acknowledge students' differences as being normal. Whenever we do that targeting, we are then limiting the possibilities for learning for all of the children in the group. So it's not surprising that we get quite a lot of evidence that says unless you're in the group that everybody thinks are the very smartest kids, your learning opportunities and your outcomes are very much limited by that practice. So we have a practice that's very popular, very common, that's based on a flawed theory, and for which there's almost no evidence of effectiveness.
back here. Okay, so as you can see from there, she kind of talked about some of the issues and the philosophies behind ability grouping and how they can sometimes not work, and that there's a lot of inconsistency with the research that is involved with ability grouping and how that plays a role and how that can affect student interaction and how they feel about each other. So let's talk about, so why is it important I'm talking about this, basically? Based on tracking or not tracking, it's a serious issue and has some severe consequences, and it can also have some really great consequences with it. And so because of that, it involves a lot of thought process and a lot of thinking from future teachers as to when and why and how to implement this kind of grouping into our classrooms. Because the fact is that most middle schools have some sort of tracking and or ability grouping involved with it. But we do find that most tracking occurs in math and language arts, which is kind of why I did this topic, because I'm going to go into math. And so it's really interesting to start researching this and seeing how ability grouping has effects on students. Another reason why tracking and ability grouping is so influential in schools nowadays is because of this standardized testing. And they're trying to push for this school-wide proficiency and being able to split up students so that you can help the struggling students to get proficient in a subject while keeping the students that are above proficiency. That's an important thing for students to deal with. So the important thing is we need to find out is how we can use a proper reuse of this grouping and implement it in a correct way. Because we have teachers do have a say about it, whether it be tracking or ability grouping every single day. So applying this information, so there's some characteristics of how to do an effective ability grouping. And what it kind of involves is making sure that all students in each group are included, that each student has this job that they're supposed to do, and that they know what they need to do in order to complete that job effectively. And when they do that, we find that students are going to become accountable and invested in the group's goal, both as an individual and a group member, because they're focused on what they need to do as a person for the job, as well as how to get the group together and complete the task. So there's also this doctor named Dr. John I might slaughter his name here. O'Flanahan, I do believe. And so he kind of talks about some good strategies that are used to group students, and it's called flexible grouping. So I'm going to try to play this video here. And this was a little bit shorter than the last one. So. Let's see. If I can get it to work. Okay.
Well, flexible grouping by definition means that you're not trapped in the same group all the time. That's it, period. So teachers have to monitor how kids are moving from group to group or whether they're trapped in a group. The worst thing you can do is trap a kid in the same group of people. It doesn't help them. They don't get to know other kids. They start to follow a very narrow path. The path is usually unrelenting. There isn't much escape from it. So we want kids who seem to belong to certain groups by virtue of their own choice or how we put them in there. We want to break down those boundaries and move them around. So if I have a group of kids who I pull together, say 8 kids, to do a little mini lesson on how to infer while you read and how to keep track of what you're thinking using Post-its, then I want to make sure that kid doesn't remain in the same skills-based group day after day after day. So it's all about balance. It's all about flexibility, because the more flexibility you bring to your approach, the greater the kids learn from each other. Well, flexible.
Okay. So as you can see, he kind of talks about how important it is to keep switching it up with students and not keeping them in the same group and continuously changing them and not letting them be too comfortable with the group that they're in. And not only does that help students learn, but that also helps them create peer relationships with their friends, with the people they may have not ever talked to in the halls before. So what it comes down to kind of is knowing your students. And once you find out about your students, you can then kind of look at, okay, what am I trying to accomplish by grouping the students in a certain way? I mean, if you're trying to learn new content, you're going to want to group them differently than if you were just reviewing or practicing problems. Another thing is give students power to form their own groups, but only if you make sure and you explicitly explain that by them choosing their own groups, they're also responsible for how well and accountable for how well they do, and that's going to reflect their grade based on how well they do as a group. And even you can also be very creative and flexible with grouping. You can group students in just about any way. I mean, you could use eye color, whether they're right or left-handed, number of siblings they have, musical preferences, all sorts of different types of grouping that you can use. It's going to promote learning, and it's going to help students learn, engage, and hopefully grow along with you. So these are these are my references that I used. And does anyone have any questions?
I do. What do you suppose would be some strategies that we could see happen in the public school system so we get away from the practice of having the seasoned teachers teach the high level courses, whereas the novice teachers end up teaching pre-algebra and algebra, the classes where we really need a seasoned veteran?
Yeah, that's tough, but I think if the veteran teachers, they get so comfortable, I think, that they are teaching the same thing over and over again, so they're like, oh, I have my curriculum set for the next 3 years, but having them switch it up and teach a younger class, or maybe having the teachers teach different subjects every year, have like a different class, whether they teach at high level, the next year they teach a low level, so they're constantly having to alter their curriculum and basically learn from their students and differentiate their instruction every year.
I agree totally. So that's why I kind of asked that question. I almost feel it would be good to be put on a rotating cycle. And I like that high ability, low ability. And you see it all the time in elementary school. There's a teacher that might have taught second grade. Well, then she goes up to sixth grade. But they make those shifts much more than we see at the high school level. So.
Sure.
Well, I have a question then. Like, if you're gonna rotate, if you have someone start with, like, say, the algebra kids when they're freshmen, do you have them just keep moving with them, like, to geometry, to algebra 2, and all the way up? Because then you have those relationships already in place with the student, and would that be more effective than, say, I teach algebra 1 year and jump all the way up to calculus and then back down? If you're staying with the same kids, wouldn't that help you know how to group them, what they need, and be more beneficial for them?
Right. Have you heard of that the name of that practice before? Do you know what it's called?
I don't know what it's called. I've never seen it done in the middle school or the high school. I've seen it done a lot in the elementary school.
Okay. It's called looping, and I agree totally. That is a good practice to have. Now, the one drawback that I've heard of is when you have, say, a conflict between a teacher and a student, their personalities just don't mesh. Well, then what do? Well, if you're in a large enough school, say at Rapids North or South Middle School or something like that, the student could be put into another teacher's classroom, and I think that makes perfect sense. But if you're at a smaller school where there's only one or there isn't a choice, and actually that's kind of it. In small schools, I know in mine, I taught 8th grade, so there was a different teacher that had 7th grade, then I had 8th grade, and then someone else did freshman, and so we kind of went back and forth, but I could see how it could be so that you could just follow that same group through. So what do the rest of you think?
I was actually thought that stuff about grouping was really interesting. I was with the same group of kids from K to 5, and while we were really close-knit, it was kind of damaging when we started to grow apart. and everybody was really cliquey, and like I wasn't allowed to grow as an individual because we all remembered every embarrassing thing about each other since we were little. And well, I mean, there's a little bit of fondness there. I mean, we definitely don't talk to each other now. But it also correlates to I'm doing my field experience in Lee Deadwood, and one of the problems the teacher is having with a exceptionality is that she's been with the same group of kids through elementary school and now in middle school, and now that she's ready to try to progress and grow and deal with some of her issues, she can't, because all of the other kids remember what she was like in elementary school, and it's hard for them to let go of everything they remember about her and all the negative interactions they had with her. So that's another thing. But I do like the idea of looping, where it's a few years, and you can, really get in depth with the learning. But I think on the long term, it's kind of negative.
I could see like for 2 years, I think. But I think that after a while, people might you would know each other better, but then sometimes it's good. It's just like for those of you that have had me for middle school classes, it's like there was a time when I was teaching all three of them, and it's like you need some more input from other professors. Otherwise, it's just middle school by Dr. Stone, and that's not good for anyone, So hopefully we're getting that changed just a little bit. I love all the classes I'm teaching, but I want it to be the best experience for you. So anybody else?
I would think too that maybe the teaching philosophies of the teachers could be an issue when it comes to looping as well. If students are, some teachers might teach one way where another teacher teaches it differently a little bit. That could also be a conflict for students as well. But
right.
So I think sometimes that different change of teacher between semesters might help some students do better in one semester than the next one, maybe not so much. Right?
Exactly. So it's just who they can relate better to, and the style, totally. So, anyone else? Well, thank you, Zachary, very much for this information. Would you be able to also email me your resources just to post them too into D2L in case anyone else would be interested? Sure. I know we all have so much time to do additional reading, but still it would be nice to put somewhere for future reference. Matter of fact, one of the things I wrote down while you were talking, that a change that I made in my Seed 408 class was this year we spent one class period, one group of students talked about differentiated instruction by looking at reading adaptations, which is more for the lower level students. And then this Tuesday, we're looking at differentiated instruction for gifted students, because they are the group that are often forgot about. When we think of differentiation, many people think IEP, and that's true, but they're not the only ones. And this one article that some of the students are reading, they're in 4 different reading groups, but it's called "Why We Run Our School Like a Gifted Program." And I think that's the way it should be, that we set the bar high and think everybody is gifted and go that way, rather than thinking that we've got the lower and it's just this elite group over here that is special, because it should be that everybody is special and can learn. So, well, all right. For those of you that were here, if you would please fill out the Google form for Zachary's presentation. It's located in this week's D2L content area and last week's too, because I thought, I put it there. But then also it's in the Google Hangout information folder too. So you've got 3 different places to access it. So if you would do that tonight before you finish your homework, that would be great. And Zachary, thank you again for sharing your information. Do you feel like you've learned some things that you didn't know before?
Yeah, I learned a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
It was good. It was
Do
good
you
to learn.
do you see how you can use some of this information in your future math classroom? So I really like the idea of that flexible grouping too, because of the fact we don't want to just keep, as Christina said, the same group together for years and years, because it's better to work with others. That's why I always go back to my Seed 408 class, but that's why they have to draw cards to see where they sit. Sometimes they get to sit by their content area, but sometimes it's with other people, so you can mix it up and meet new people, let alone hear different perspectives rather than the ones that you already are familiar with. So that being said, thank you everybody for attending tonight, and we'll be on again next Thursday at 8 o'clock as well. I will send out another invite like this rather than going to our Google Hangout that I set up the first week of school, because that one hasn't been as successful as this seems to be, by just sending out the invite at the day of. So we'll just plan on that. So thank you everybody for being here, and have a great week. If you have any questions on the rest of your assignment, please post them to the D2L discussion area. All right, thanks. Bye-bye. Who's going to sign out first? We'll see. Thank you.